Hi and welcome to part 3 of Alan Carr's Easy Way to Stop Smoking online seminar. In part 2 we debunk the myths associated with smoking, and now it's time to talk about addiction. We all started smoking for the same reason, really just to fit in with the cool kids and what have you. But if we smoke into adulthood, as obviously we all did, it's really for a combination of 2 reasons. Firstly, we become physically addicted to nicotine, and secondly, the brainwashing to which we've been exposed growing up begins to kick in. And it's really a combination of these 2 things, physical addiction to nicotine and the brainwashing, that kind of locks the trap shut. Now, I'm going to deal with these 2 topics separately. First, I'm going to deal with physical addiction to nicotine, and then I'll move on to the brainwashing. Now, I'm sure that you have come to this conclusion already independently, that at some level you must be physically addicted to nicotine. But what is physical addiction to nicotine? And I think just as importantly, what is physical withdrawal from nicotine? You see, for me, these are 2 of the most misunderstood concepts in modern medicine, and I want to take a couple of minutes. You know, if you're going to become a happy non-smoker, then it's absolutely critical that you have a really good working understanding of these issues. Now, nicotine is one of the most powerfully addictive drugs known to man. The process of addiction is initiated after just one cigarette. One cigarette. It is the speed with which it hooks its victims, which is where nicotine takes its real power from. But the great news is that actual physical withdrawal from nicotine is very, very weak indeed. And in fact, this is one of the subtleties of the nicotine trap. And this weakness is demonstrated by the withdrawal process itself. Now, the vast majority of smokers, they believe that they only go into withdrawal from nicotine when they try to stop smoking. This is not true. The reality is that smokers go into physical withdrawal from nicotine the second they put out a cigarette. 20 minutes after putting out a cigarette, your body is 50% nicotine-free. After 1 hour of not smoking, your body is 75% nicotine-free. During that first hour, in a sense, your body has gone through the worst physical withdrawal that you will ever experience, because this is when the drug is leaving your body at the highest rate. But the truth is that even chain smokers can and do go several hours a day without smoking. It doesn't bother them in the slightest. If you smoked a cigarette, very last thing before you went to sleep at night and put it out, after 6 hours, if you slept for 6 hours, when you wake up in the morning, your body is 97% nicotine-free. During the night while you've been asleep, your body's been going through physical withdrawal the whole... I mean, this is a physical, a chemical process. It doesn't stop just because you've gone to sleep. The point I'm trying to make here is that physical withdrawal from nicotine is so mild that it doesn't even wake you up. I mean, even heavy smokers routinely sleep through the night, going through physical withdrawal from nicotine the whole time. And it's so mild that it doesn't even wake them up. I mean, what are we so scared of here? The feelings of panic and anxiety that many smokers refer to as physical withdrawal from nicotine actually are not caused by physical withdrawal from nicotine. In fact, they cannot be caused by physical withdrawal from nicotine. Because if it was physical withdrawal from nicotine that was creating these feelings, every smoker would wake up every single night several times to smoke. This doesn't happen. This is a critical point, and it's well worth repeating. Whenever a smoker is not smoking, they are in physical withdrawal from nicotine. But the truth is that physical withdrawal is so slight, they barely even notice it. So how is it that a heavy smoker can sleep for 8 hours going through physical withdrawal from nicotine the whole time? It doesn't bother him the slightest. Yet when he's trying to quit smoking, he can have a nick fit of biblical proportions seconds after putting out his final cigarette. It just doesn't make any sense that this is physical withdrawal from nicotine. It has to be something else. We are forced to consider the possibility that these feelings of fear, of panic, of anxiety, they are nothing to do with physical withdrawal from nicotine. When I talk about this topic, I'm often reminded of something that happened to me a couple of years ago. I was spending some time with my brother a couple of years ago, and I ended up babysitting my 9-year-old nephew for an evening. And when it came to bedtime, he was playing his PlayStation, like most kids, and pretty reluctant to go to bed. So I said to him, "Okay, you know, it's time to go to bed. Let's go." And of course, he just carried on playing his PlayStation, completely ignoring me. But when it became clear that I was going to insist that he put this thing down and went to bed, my little angel turned into a little devil, and I'm sure you've seen the same thing yourself on many occasions. I mean, this little guy threw a major tantrum. He was sweating, he was shaking, he's gone bright red, he's pounding the carpet with his fist. If I'd put a heart monitor on him, you know, it would have been off the scale. Now, these are genuine physical symptoms. There is absolutely no question about this. But was there a physical cause of these symptoms? Of course not. They started up here. These feelings are caused by conflict. They're caused by, in this case, the conflict of wanting to keep playing PlayStation, but not being allowed to stop, or being forced to stop. And most parents, or many parents, have been down this path. I want to keep playing. You're going to bed. I want to keep playing. You're going to bed. But this is my best score. You're going to bed. I've got to keep playing. You can't. I want to. You can't. Ah! That's where these feelings come from. It's nothing to do with physical withdrawal from PlayStation. It's to do with conflict. And these feelings of frustration, of panic and anxiety, this is precisely what people who are trying to quit smoking using willpower suffer from. You see, it's the conflict again. They want to quit, but because they believe that the cigarette helps them relieve stress or relax, they also want to smoke. This conflict can be excruciating. I want a cigarette. I can't. I want one. I can't. I want one. I can't. I have to smoke. I mustn't. My head's going to explode. I don't care. Ah! That's where these feelings come from. Can you see how this conflict would very easily create symptoms of panic and anxiety and sweaty palms and so on and so forth? You see, it's not physical withdrawal from nicotine that creates these feelings. It's conflict. And this seminar is designed to remove that conflict. And of course, with no conflict, it is very easy to stop smoking. Think about it this way. Does it take you willpower not to hit yourself in the head with a hammer? I'm guessing not. Why not? Well, I'm probably not having to hold you back from hitting yourself in the head with a hammer, because it's likely that you see that there are no benefits to hitting yourself in the head with a hammer. As a result, you have no desire to do so. And because you have no desire to do so, it doesn't take you willpower not to do so. So perhaps, if I can help you see smoking the same way you see hitting yourself over the head with a hammer, perhaps you will have no desire to smoke. And of course, with no desire to smoke, it doesn't take willpower not to, in much the same way that it doesn't take willpower not to do other things that you don't want to do. Now, am I saying that physical withdrawal from nicotine doesn't exist? No, I'm not. I'm not saying that at all. What I'm saying is that physical withdrawal from nicotine is so mild that it's virtually imperceptible. In fact, it's so mild that many smokers, frankly, are more or less unaware of physical withdrawal from nicotine for the whole of their smoking lives. If you feel anything at all at a physical level between smoking your final cigarette in part 5 of this presentation and 72 hours later when the last of the nicotine leaves your body and you are technically no longer an addict, it'll just be a slight empty feeling in the pit of your stomach. Very, very similar to hunger, actually. In fact, this is why so many smokers confuse eating and smoking, or believe that cigarettes are an appetite suppressant. They believe that smoking gets rid of a hunger pang, when it's just that a nicotine pang and a hunger pang feel very similar. They confuse the two. Some people also experience a slight tightness in the chest, or a slightly sick, nauseous feeling. The same feeling you kind of get when you've forgotten something. You've forgotten something important and you don't quite know what it is. This is basically physical withdrawal from nicotine. Everything else, the fear, the panic, the anxiety, the sweaty palms, the irritability, the yearning to smoke, all of these things are nothing to do with physical withdrawal from nicotine. They are genuine physical symptoms, that I will agree, but there is no physical cause of these symptoms. As I mentioned before with the example about PlayStation, it's not physical withdrawal, it's all about conflict and removing that conflict. Our reaction to that slightly empty feeling, which is physical withdrawal from nicotine, our reaction to this feeling is to want to light a cigarette almost automatically. And after years and years and years of repetition, we begin to interpret this feeling as a need to smoke. But if you can't light up, what happens? You want to, you can't, you want to, you can't, you want to, you can't. This develops into a genuinely full-blown anxiety and morphs very often into the other symptoms that I describe, which typically become more pronounced the longer and longer the conflict goes. And of course, when the smoker is eventually able to light up, all of the anxiety, all of the fear, all of the irritability goes. And this is the illusion of pleasure, or the illusion of stress relief that the cigarette provides. We end up giving the cigarette the credit for making us feel a bit better, when of course we should be blaming the previous cigarette for making us feel anxious and edgy and irritable in the first place. I mean, think about it logically. If quitting smoking was all about beating the physical withdrawal, then you could slap a patch on and not even think about smoking. But it doesn't work, does it? Because a patch doesn't help you deal with the beliefs that you have about smoking. That it helps you relax, that it helps you concentrate, that it helps you cope with stress, that it keeps you thin, and so on and so forth. You see, because if you believe these things, then you will have a desire to smoke, irrespective of whether you're wearing a patch or chewing nicotine gum. And if you have a desire to smoke, you're going to have to use willpower to try to overcome that desire. And of course, as we've already seen, whenever willpower is involved, it is a sure recipe for misery. In his best-selling books, Alan Carr describes the physical aspect of nicotine addiction as the little monster. Now, on its own, this monster has absolutely no power, apart from the power you give it. The reality is you sleep through this feeling of withdrawal every single night when you go to bed, and it's so mild that it doesn't even wake you up. The reality is that you can squish this little monster. It is utterly insignificant. The danger of this little monster is that it feeds the big monster. And the big monster is the brainwashing. And that's really what we're going to spend the rest of part 3 talking about. Now, if you have grown up in North America or Western Europe or, quite frankly, any market that has a high degree of TV and movie penetration, then your exposure to the brainwashing is likely to be fairly profound. It starts very young and it goes surprisingly deep, actually. Let me give you an example. When I visit Los Angeles, I usually stay with some friends of ours, Anne and John. And my friends Anne and John are a typical LA couple, actually. Fascist anti-smokers. They don't know any smokers. They don't want to know any smokers. They won't have smoking workmen in the house. I mean, the whole 9 yards. Anyway, one of the times I was visiting them, I was playing with their son Max, who is, I think, probably 4.5, somewhere around there. And I was drawing these little shapes, and I wanted him to colour in these shapes. And I turned around and looked at this young boy, and he was sitting there smoking one of his colouring pencils. Now, I remember doing this when I was a child, but you see, I know where I got it from. I mean, everyone I knew smoked. All of my parents smoked, every adult that I knew smoked, and I was just copying them, trying to emulate them. But I'm thinking, where has Max got this from? Where on earth has he got this from? I mean, I doubt this little boy had ever even met a smoker. And then I thought about it for a minute, and I think, well, he's sitting in the back of Anne's Jeep in his little booster seat driving around the town. He sees people sitting in traffic smoking. He sees people standing outside office blocks smoking. He sees people on the decks outside restaurants smoking. TV. I mean, it's all over TV, isn't it? Do you remember those old war movies? Guy's about to be shot by a firing squad. What's his last request? That's right, cigarette. Think about that for a moment. How do you think a young child would interpret a scene like this in a movie? Wouldn't they be led to believe that the cigarette was, I don't know, better than special? Because even when confronted with certain death, So long as I have my little friend, everything will be okay. Can you see that these are very, very powerful messages to send to very, very young children? Yeah. And let's face it, the tobacco industry are absolute masters of marketing. In 2006, the tobacco industry spent an estimated $15.5 billion on promoting tobacco in the US. Considering they're not allowed to advertise on radio, they're not allowed to advertise on TV, they're not allowed to advertise outdoors or in most magazines. Boy, spending $15.5 billion, that's quite a feat, isn't it? I mean, tobacco companies claim that they're using this money to fight for market share among adult smokers. But there are many very, objective commentators who look at this and they question this claim. I mean, only about 10% of smokers switch brand every year. And that values the switching category among smokers at around $5 billion a year. Still a big market, but $5 billion a year. You tell me, who would spend $15.5 billion competing for a sector worth $5 billion? It just doesn't make sense. The reality is that when you're in an industry where you're killing 4 million of your own customers every year, recruiting new customers is a commercial imperative. Now, given that virtually no adults ever start smoking, the industry's only option is to market to young people. And the younger, the better. Without being seen to be marketing to minors, you have to market to as young a demographic as possible. And there are many examples of this. Throughout the 70s, the 80s, the 90s. I mean, think of the Joe Camel character. Think of the Marlboro logo being on screen for over 4 minutes during one of the Superman movies. Think of Bruce Willis chain-smoking Marlboro Red in Die Hard. You know as well as I do, nothing appears on a screen unless someone has paid for it. Do you really think that the cigarettes appear on screen by accident? The tobacco industry has always had a love affair with Hollywood. And it has always used Hollywood as the primary vehicle for communicating the glamour of smoking. I mean, think back to the old days. Marlene Dietrich, Betty Davis, Greta Garbo, Humphrey Bogart, Spencer Tracy, Cary Grant, John Wayne, Bruce Willis, Leonardo DiCaprio, Brad Pitt, Sissy Spacek, Sarah Jessica Parker, Sharon Stone, Julia Roberts. I mean, what better ad could you have than all these people smoking? And it's still going on today. Really, what better ad could you have than seeing all of these great Hollywood stars and personalities smoking on screen? I remember what did it for me. The opening sequence of Saturday Night Fever. John Travolta walking down 4th Avenue in Brooklyn, carrying 2 tins of paint, smoking a cigarette. I thought it was the coolest thing I'd ever seen. I couldn't wait to be a smoker. You might think that these days things have changed, but have they? I mean, I readily admit that you really don't see that much smoking in adult movies these days. But as I already pointed out, the tobacco industry is not particularly interested in marketing to adults. So what about kids' movies? Well, if we look at all of the top 50 movies that are rated G, PG, PG-13, we see that 73% of these movies feature smoking scenes in them. In fact, studies indicate that the incidence of smoking in movies now is higher than at any time since the 1950s. I will let you draw your own conclusions from this. So this is the part of the brainwashing that surrounds smoking. Virtually from birth, we are bombarded with these messages about smoking. That normal people smoke, that beautiful people smoke, that everybody smokes. And of course, smokers themselves drink the Kool-Aid too. You know, telling each other how they couldn't survive life without their little friend, how they need to smoke to relax or to enjoy themselves or to cope with stress, and of course how difficult it all is to quit. So on the one hand, we have these very uncool people, parents and teachers, telling kids not to smoke. But on the other hand, we have movie stars and rock stars and all of these people smoking their heads off. I mean, which one did you go for when you were a kid? I know which one I did. But you know the odd thing with the brainwashing? It really doesn't kick in until you start smoking. This might seem a very obvious point, but it's one, it's still worth making. Before you started smoking, you were perfectly happy to be a non-smoker. I mean, I think that we feel that we've been smoking so long that it's almost like we were born into the smoking ward of a hospital with a Marlboro light dangling out of our mouths. But we weren't. We put this thing in there. And you can learn how to take it out just as easily. The reality is that it was only when you started to smoke that you started to depend on the cigarette in certain situations. Before you started to smoke, you were just getting through these situations on your own. And probably making a pretty decent job of it as well. It's worth bearing this in mind, and it's your 8th instruction. You've been a happy non-smoker before, and you can be one again. No one but yourself is forcing you to smoke this cigarette. No one. You didn't smoke during your early childhood, yet you cope with stress easily. I mean, let's face it, the majority of stress in life is created by change. And when you're a kid, everything's changing all the time. But you are perfectly able to cope with that stress, without the use of this drug, or any other drug for that matter. It was only when you started to smoke that you started to depend on the cigarette. The weird thing with these first few cigarettes, I think, even for those of us who started as children, and I think what actually springs the trap for most smokers, is not how great they are, it's how disgusting they are. If the first cigarettes we smoked were absolutely amazing, I think we'd be a lot more wary. People that have experienced with heavier drugs very often experience this. The drug appears to make you feel good, but then this triggers a logical fear. Hold on a sec. If something makes me feel this good, there's got to be a price. And many people realize the price is going to be too high. They never go near drugs again. They instinctively know this. But with smoking, it's the absolute opposite. For most young smokers, and by most I mean maybe 99% of young smokers, those first cigarettes are absolutely disgusting. And in our young minds, we just can't believe that we could get addicted to something so awful. The added fact that the cigarette doesn't even get you high, this is what seals the deal for most young smokers. Because they now feel very safe and very secure in the knowledge that they could never get addicted to a drug that A, is disgusting, and B, doesn't even get them high. What they fail to realize is that pleasure does not necessarily equal addiction. We see smoking those first cigarettes in much the same way that we see other adolescent activities. Your first alcoholic drink, the first time you drive a car, the first time, your first sexual experience, the first night out with friends, and so on. We see this as a kind of fairly innocent rite of passage, I beg your pardon, but we now know something very different. That young child, is taking their first dose of this extremely addictive substance. And when they put out the cigarette for the first time, and the nicotine begins to leave the body for the first time, and the body goes into quote-unquote physical withdrawal from nicotine, we get this very, very slightly empty feeling in the pit of your stomach. Very, very similar to hunger. Now, this is happening at such a low level that at a cognitive level, we're not even aware of this. This is all happening well beneath the level of our conscious mind. Now, if the child had not smoked a second cigarette, then the nicotine just worked its way out of your system, everything goes back to normal. But you didn't do that, and I didn't do that. We interrupted this cycle by smoking a second cigarette. And when you lit that second cigarette, it restored the nicotine to your body, and that slightly empty feeling went away. And at this point, your subconscious brain made a connection. At this point, your subconscious brain says, oh, okay, I get it. I need this to get rid of this. What your subconscious brain didn't understand is that this was created by the previous cigarette. And this is the scam. This is the con trick of all drug addiction. Picture a heroin addict withdrawing from heroin. I don't know if any of you have experienced this or you work with addicts, but I see this on a very frequent basis. These guys are in absolute agony. They're sweating, they're shaking, the major muscle groups are cramping, they feel like their joints are going to explode. They're in absolute agony. And then picture the relief. Bang! When they can shoot up and reintroduce the drug into their system. All of these horrible symptoms just washed away, replaced by this feeling of normality, really. Does that sound like pleasure to you? If you saw that process going on in front of your eyes, would you sit there and think to yourself, boy, that looks like fun. I'm going to go and get me some of that stuff. Or would you know very well that all of these horrible symptoms were created by the previous dose of the drug? It's so obvious, isn't it, when you look at other people's addictions. Well, guess what, guys? Non-smokers don't have a feeling of not being able to concentrate. Non-smokers don't get a feeling of not being able to relax. Non-smokers don't have this inability to cope with stress. It's smokers that have these feelings, because smoking creates these feelings. The first cigarette of the day illustrates this illusion perfectly. For many smokers, it's the most important cigarette of the day. It's not often a particularly enjoyable cigarette, but it's often the most special. And the reason for this is that when we wake up in the morning, we go through a process of removing aggravations that have built up during the night while we've been asleep. So you have a full bladder, so you go to the restroom. You feel a bit dopey, a bit sleepy, so you splash some water on your face, or you jump in the shower. You're hungry and thirsty because you haven't eaten and drunk for several hours, so you spark up some coffee, or you grab some juice, or whatever. But a smoker has another little aggravation, because for 8 hours, this little guy hasn't been fed. And until you feed him, you're going to feel very slightly anxious and edgy. So we smoke to remove these feelings. And by removing these feelings, now I feel like a non-smoker. We're back to this idea of smoking to try to feel like a non-smoker. Alan in his books actually explains this process absolutely brilliantly. He says that if you're wearing a pair of really tight shoes, it feels fantastic at the end of the day when you get to take them off. But if you think about it, all we're really enjoying there is feeling normal again. I mean, this is not a good reason to go around wearing tight shoes, just because it feels a bit better when you take them off. It would be a bit like me, I don't know, banging my head against a brick wall because it feels a bit better when I stop. Let me show you exactly what I mean here. Let's say that before we started smoking, we were all normal. When we put out our first cigarette, the nicotine started to leave our body, which put us down here with this slightly empty feeling. By smoking a second cigarette, the nicotine was restored and the empty feeling went away, leaving us once again feeling normal. But as soon as we put out that cigarette, the nicotine began to leave the body, and soon we're back down here again with a slightly empty feeling. Bear in mind that this is all happening at such a low level, our conscious brains are not even aware of it. When we smoked a third cigarette, the nicotine was once again restored and we felt normal again. But the same thing happened, and soon we were back down here, feeling a little empty again. Now, fairly early on in our smoking lives, when we light a cigarette, we don't quite get back to normal. The reason for this is, like with every other drug on the planet, we begin to create some tolerance or immunity. Most people who drink alcohol will be familiar with this concept. When you were a young drinker, you probably felt the effects of alcohol after just a couple of sips, whereas now it might take a few drinks. And it's the same with smoking. I'm not particularly concerned whether it's the 3rd or the 30th or the 300th cigarette. I'm just saying that at some point fairly early on in your smoking life, this cigarette has slightly less of an impact than the one before it. But of course we withdraw from it all the same, leaving us in a situation where we now need to smoke more to feel normal, or as close to normal as we'll ever feel again when we continue to smoke. Unfortunately, the more you smoke, the less effect each cigarette has. And this illustrates perfectly the process by which we become addicted and begin to believe that some cigarettes provide some sort of benefit or pleasure. It's also gradual, isn't it? And you never get the feeling that you're out of control. We smoke a bit when we're younger, and very gradually the cigarette begins to take over. The first time you realize you have a problem is the first time you try to quit and find you can't. And it's often years after someone starts to smoke. Now, I think there are a couple of very interesting things we can learn from this diagram. The first and most obvious is that the cigarette never makes you feel better than a non-smoker. We are only ever trying to get back to where we were the whole time before we got addicted. And to be honest, this is a very common theme with drug addiction. We do our drug to remove the symptoms of withdrawal, and in so doing, temporarily get to feel like someone who doesn't do the drug. The second thing we can see is that as long-term smokers, we now spend so much of our lives down here that we think it's normal. What we forget is that we should be up here. And this is the journey that you are about to start, the journey back to normality. The third thing to notice about this diagram is that in common with other drug addicts, smokers ever only acknowledge the illusory boost that the cigarette gives us. Here, and here, and here. What we very conveniently forget is that it was the previous cigarette that put us down there in the first place needing a boost. Obviously, non-smokers don't need this boost because they're up here the whole time feeling normal. When I look at this diagram, I'm often reminded of John Steinbeck's amazing book of Mice and Men. There are two friends, Lenny and George, and Lenny idolizes George because George saved him from drowning. But what he forgets is that it was George that pushed him in the first place. It's exactly the same with smoking. We give the cigarette the credit for making us feel a bit better when we should be blaming the previous one for making us feel lousy in the first place. But the worst thing for smokers is that at some point along this line, there comes a time when you realize, usually with a sinking heart, that you no longer smoke when you want to or because you want to. You smoke because you can't stop. And as soon as we realize this, we start looking for ways to escape. I want to return for a moment to those so-called special cigarettes. If you're talking to a heavy smoker, as obviously we do on a fairly frequent basis, and if they're being honest with you, which isn't really only always the case, they'll tell you that out of the, say, 30 or 40 a day they smoke, that they only really enjoy, and I use the word enjoy in the loosest possible sense, that they only really enjoy 2, 3, 4, absolute maximum 5 cigarettes a day. We always ask such smokers the same question. If you only really enjoy 3 or 4, let's call it 5 a day, then why bother smoking the other 35? Actually, this is a very, very, very good question. Bear in mind, we're not telling these guys to stop smoking. We're just telling them to stop smoking the ones they don't enjoy. Can't do it though, can you? At this point, some smokers will mumble something about habit or something like this, but, you know, I don't buy it. I mean, don't misunderstand me. I think there is a lot about smoking that is habitual, but smoking itself is not a habit. And even if it was, why would it be so difficult to break? I mean, we make and break habits all the time, don't we? I mean, I live here in North America, and obviously I drive on the right, but I fly to the UK several times for meetings and conferences and so on, and I pick up my hire car at Heathrow, and I drive on the left. I'm in the habit of driving on the right, but I change that habit. And when I get back home, I change it again. There's no mental anguish, there's no physical torture involved. It's a habit. You change it back. If smoking was a habit, why would it be so difficult to change? Let's think about it this way. Let's assume for a minute that you work with someone who is, I don't know, a crack addict, say. And they say to you, at 10 o'clock in the morning I smoke crack because I'm an addict. At 12 I smoke it because I'm an addict. At 2 I smoke it because I'm an addict. But at 4 o'clock I smoke crack because I really enjoy it. Would you believe this person? Of course not. It's really so obvious when you look at other people's addictions, isn't it? Well, how can we smoke this cigarette to relieve stress, this one to keep you thin, this one to relax you? They're all identical. Can you see the connection between smoking crack and smoking tobacco? It's all of the addiction, just with none of the high. And you really need to get this crystal clear in your mind. You didn't get addicted to nicotine because you got into the habit of smoking. It's the other way around. Because very early on in your smoking life, you became physically addicted to nicotine. You had to build a smoking habit to service that addiction. In most cases, the cigarette very subtly comes to control every aspect of your waking life, and you actually end up designing your whole life around your need to smoke. It dictates where you go, what you do, who you see, who you avoid seeing, where you eat, where you drink, where you work, where you go on vacation. And once you begin to sense this, frankly, you can't even pretend to enjoy smoking anymore. It's slavery, pure and simple. I thought that the main benefits of stopping smoking would be health and money. And while these two things improved very, very dramatically when I quit smoking, it has been the many other smaller things that I never associated with smoking that, ironically, I've ended up enjoying the most. For example, my energy levels. When I was a smoker, I just never had any energy. I would wake up tired, drag myself through the day. By 3 o'clock in the afternoon, I could have gone down and had a nap. Like a toddler. Yet this was a 20, 30-year-old man supposed to be in the prime of life. It was crazy. About the third day after I quit smoking, I woke up crackling with energy. I felt like a cell phone that had been charged up overnight. It felt absolutely fantastic. And those energy levels have stayed with me until this day. And people talk about putting weight on when they stop smoking. I lost tons of weight. I lost 35 pounds in the first 4 months after I quit smoking. You see, I had never thought about the impact that smoking had on other areas of my life. For instance, I was a terrible eater when I was a smoker. I mean, I guess it's because smoking had compromised my sense of smell and taste. So I tended to eat foods that were very high in salt, very high in sugar, very high in fat. I mean, these were the only foods I could taste, really. And of course, I never wanted to stop and prepare fresh fruit and vegetables and so on, because it interferes with your smoking time. So I used to eat a lot of food on the run, a lot of junk food, a lot of fast food. And of course, this is the worst kind of food for you. I also drank way too much when I smoked. I had 2 young girls, and there was no way I would smoke in the house with my girls there. And there's no way I'm going to stand outside and smoke in a 10-degree northeastern winter. So I used to go up to the village pub and smoke. And I would sit there in this pub 7 nights a week and drink 5, 6 pints of beer every single night, just so I could be somewhere where I could smoke. Don't laugh. I mean, 86% of alcoholics are smokers. It really makes you wonder which one is driving which. When I quit smoking, I cut down my drinking, I would say, by around 90%. Because I realized that 90% of my drinking was just so I could be somewhere where I could smoke. And when you're smoking between 2 and 3 packs a day, you will understand me when I tell you that exercise wasn't particularly high up on my agenda. So when I quit smoking, and my taste, my senses and smell of taste woke up, I started eating properly. I mean, it wasn't a conscious decision. It just kind of happened that way. I more or less gave up junk food. I stopped consuming these vast quantities of alcohol. And because I had energy, and for the first time self-esteem to want to improve myself, it really motivated me to get up and get exercising. And to be honest with you, the weight fell off me. I felt like $1 trillion. I really did. But there were tons of other things about smoking as well. In winter, I could never get my fingers and toes warm. They'd be like little blocks of ice. This is the impact of smoking on the circulation, actually. I mean, I never really realized this, but smoking thickens the blood. It coagulates the blood, and it puts a thick layer of plaque around our veins and our arteries and our capillaries. And so your poor heart is trying to pump this ever-thickening gunge through these ever-narrowing vessels, and it just can't reach the extremities. I mean, when I was a smoker, I could never get warm. And as a non-smoker, I just never get cold. It's the difference is like night and day. But to be honest with you, I don't need to see a smoker light up to know that they're smokers. I mean, the vast majority of smokers I can tell just by their complexions. Smokers have a slightly greyish complexion to them. Because what has happened is the capillaries taking the blood to the face get blocked. And that's what gives smokers this slightly greyish colour. But the great news is that after 2-3 days, the capillaries open up and the blood comes back to the face, and the complexion changes, in some cases very dramatically, actually. And ignore these old wives' tales about every cigarette you smoke taking 7 minutes off your life, or whatever it's supposed to be these days. I once had dinner with Alan Carr, and we sat down and worked out on the back of a napkin that with the amount he smoked, he should have died in 1971. And, well, he looked pretty good for a dead guy, I can tell you. The truth is that unless you've already been diagnosed with a smoking-related disease or condition, then your health recovers extremely quickly when you quit smoking. I think this is one of the most amazing things about the body. You know, in a sense, we spend decades pounding these poisons into our system, and as soon as you stop doing it, your body bounces back and starts to repair itself. It's an absolute miracle. I mean, get this for a statistic. 24 hours after putting out your final cigarette, your chance of suffering from a heart attack is cut in half. I mean, I just find that absolutely amazing. Within days, your lung capacity begins to improve, your recovery rate begins to improve. There is a cascade of positive physical change that you're about to go through. So you should give yourself permission to enjoy the ride. It's an amazing one. And of course, the sheer slavery of smoking had never even dawned on me. Being absolutely controlled by a 4-inch stick of dry vegetable matter from the moment you wake up in the morning to the moment you go to bed at night. It just never occurred to me that there was a different way to live life, you know, that there was an alternative to being dominated by this thing. You know, my whole life as a smoker was one continuous attempt to try and create an excuse to go out and smoke. And the slavery is brutal because it never gives you a day off. It never gives you even a couple of hours off. And of course, if you want to quit, things are even worse. Because you spend half of your days in situations where you can't smoke, feeling anxious and deprived, and the other half of your days in situations where you can smoke, feeling guilty and stupid. You know, vacillating between feeling anxious and deprived on the one hand, or guilty and stupid on the other. I mean, this is not a fun way to go through life. But I think there are two things that happened to me that I have ended up enjoying more than everything else put together, above many of these other many wonderful things. There are two things that I think I've ended up enjoying. The first is a massive increase in my self-respect. And when I say massive, I mean massive. You know, when you spend your day pounding these things down, it is very difficult to feel good about yourself. I think we get very good at pushing all the fears about smoking to the back of our minds, but they're always lurking, they're always bubbling just under the surface. It just feels so good when you get rid of this ball and chain that has been dragging you down and holding you back for all these years, and when you realize for the first time that you can be the person that you've always wanted to be, and that you know you're capable of being. Really, you endow yourself with two amazing gifts when you decide to quit smoking. The gift of a fuller, happier life, and the gift of true freedom. The second thing that I've ended up really celebrating is that I rediscovered my passion for life, as the French would say, my joie de vivre. In the last few years of my smoking, to be honest, I was not really having very much fun at all. We have smoking-related cancer on both sides of my family. Everyone who smokes in our family gets killed by it. And there I was, smoking 60 a day, drinking like a fish, not exercising. I mean, to be honest with you, I felt like an absolute idiot. I felt like I was pouring kerosene on my own funeral pyre. It was crazy. My wife was beginning to withdraw from me. I think emotionally she was preparing herself for life as a single parent. I felt absolutely wretched. I mean, I love my family more than anything on the planet. But when I was a smoker, I couldn't wait to be away from them so I could go and smoke. And I think that's the real problem with smoking, actually, is that it drives a wedge between you and the things and the people that you genuinely love in life. I mean, at school, I had been a great athlete. I lost that to smoking. Now, I was fortunate to be part of an amazing family. And there I was, losing them too, choosing the cigarette over my own family. The truth is, the day I got this thing out of my life, I became a better husband, I became a better father, I became a better person. Because for the first time, I was able to put my family first. I cannot begin to describe to you how wonderful it feels to finally be able to be that person that I'd always wanted to be. I mean, life isn't perfect, you know, far from it. But at least I don't need to go through it, you know, feeling anxious and guilty and stupid and frightened on top of everything. The thing that made Alan begin to think about smoking in this very unconventional way, I think, was his own personal philosophy. Like many very intelligent people, Alan had a very simple philosophy on life. Basically what he was saying is that, I don't know, irrespective of how you think we got here, to argue that we are somehow incomplete without cigarettes is to argue that we're either smarter than forces of nature or we're smarter than God. And I don't know about you, but it just doesn't smell right to me at all. I mean, if we were supposed to be smokers, we would have been fitted with a filter to filter everything out. But we weren't. So they stick them on the end of cigarettes. But of course they don't work properly. I mean, because if they worked properly, you wouldn't get any nicotine. And if you didn't get any nicotine, what's the point of smoking? I mean, don't take my word for it. In 1989, Philip Morris, the biggest tobacco company in the world, launched a brand of cigarette called Next. And this cigarette was described by many people as every smoker's dream. Supposedly it was a safe cigarette. What had happened is that they had found a process for extracting the nicotine out of tobacco. I suppose a little bit like decaffeination and coffee beans. So no nicotine, not addictive. And then there was a mechanism in the filter that absorbed all of the tar. So no nicotine, not addictive. No tar, can't kill you. I think every smoker in California, this product was test marketed in California, I think every smoker in California bought a pack of these things. But they only bought one. Because as soon as they realized that there was no nicotine in these cigarettes, well, what's the point of smoking? The brand was pulled, not immediately, but after about 2 or 3 months. Who knows, perhaps tobacco companies were concerned that smokers were kind of figuring it all out. But again, you know, don't take my word for it. I mean, think about this in another context. I mean, do you think that heroin addicts do this because they enjoy the physical act of shooting a hypodermic into their arm? Or do you think they do it to get the drug? They do it to get the drug, of course. What about a coke addict? Do you think that a coke addict snorts coke because they enjoy the physical act of snorting foreign particles up their nose? Or do you think they do it to get the drug? Of course, they do it to get the drug. Following this line of logic, is it not clear that the only reason that we do this is to get the drug that's in here? I mean, this point is reinforced by the fact that the market for tobacco-based cigarettes in the US is over $50 billion, and the market for non-tobacco cigarettes is about 22 million. One has nicotine, one doesn't. Americans smoke tobacco cigarettes at about 2,600 to 1 over herbal cigarettes. There's a lesson in there somewhere. Actually, I'm convinced that the only people that smoke herbal cigarettes are smokers who are trying to quit. You know, they still believe that there is some pleasure in the physical act of smoking, but they don't want to be, you know, addicted to nicotine anymore. But the fact is that they realize that without nicotine in the cigarette, there's just no point of smoking. I mean, it's like a coke addict snorting a line of flour just because it's white and powdery. Absolutely pointless. Most smokers of herbal cigarettes switch back to the quote-unquote the real thing in no time at all. Because the truth is we don't smoke for the pleasure of smoking. We learn how to tolerate the inconvenience and unpleasantness of smoking so that we can get our drug, nicotine. You need to see smoking in this way, like, I don't know, plunging your hand in a vat of boiling oil just because it feels a bit better when you pull it out. There are only 3 essentials to finding it easy to stop smoking. And the first is to realize that there's nothing to give up. And I want to be very, very clear about this. I'm not saying that the disadvantages of smoking outweigh the advantages. I'm not saying that at all. I'm saying that there are no advantages. None whatsoever. Only illusions. Most of which were sold to you as a very young child. And which appeared to kind of be confirmed when your young brain got tricked into seeing the alleviation of withdrawal as genuine pleasure. You know, but again, don't take my word for any of this. Pick up your packet of cigarettes. There'll be a toll-free number on there somewhere. Give these guys a call. Give your tobacco company a call. Say to them, hey, how you doing? My name's John, Jane, whatever. I'm over 18. I'm thinking about becoming a smoker. Please explain to me the benefits of your product. What do you think they'd say? I mean, after all, this is not an unreasonable question, is it? I mean, if you ask just about anyone who is involved in business what the benefits of doing business with their organization are, they'll tell you, bang, 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 these are the benefits of doing business with our company. What do you think the tobacco companies would say? I must have this wrong. Pick up your packet of cigarettes, everyone. Pick up your packet of cigarettes. Take a look. Show me where it says smoking relieves stress. Show me where it says tobacco can be used as part of a calorie-controlled diet for weight maintenance. Tell me where it says smoking aids relaxation, or smoking relieves anxiety, or smoking helps you cope with emotions. Okay, my next question is, why doesn't it say any of these things? We are lucky to live in a part of the world that celebrates freedom more than anywhere else on the planet. And this particularly goes for freedom of speech. If something is true, you're allowed to say it. So why doesn't it say any of these things on the pack? Because they're not true. I mean, think about it. We're told that the 21st century diseases are stress and obesity. If, as smokers claim, smoking relieves stress, if, as smokers claim, smoking helps keep them thin, it is inconceivable to me that they would not mention this on pack. In fact, they would build their whole brands around these characteristics. You would have brands like, I don't know, Stress Buster or Relax. There is absolutely nothing to give up here. If there were any benefits to smoking whatsoever, they'd be plastered all over the pack, or you could give these guys a call and they could describe them to you. There's literally nothing to give up here. One final thought and we'll take a break. It's a rule of language that if something exists, we have a word to describe it. And we have words to describe the effects of all sorts of drugs. It doesn't necessarily mean they're good or bad, but it means they're real, they exist. So we have words and phrases like smacked up, tripping, speeding, coked up, loved up, pissed, smashed, stoned. We have millions of expressions to describe the effects of all sorts of drugs. Now, before I turned into an old fogey, I did my fair share of partying. And in all those years, I never once heard someone say, you know, I was out the other night and I got really nicked up. I went to a party the other day, I got tobaccoed off my face. It was crazy. It just doesn't exist. There's nothing to give up here. We don't use these words because the feeling doesn't exist. If it did, there would be a word for it. Again, there is nothing to give up apart from some illusions that you were sold as a very young child, which appeared to be confirmed when your young brain got tricked into seeing the alleviation of withdrawal as genuine pleasure. And with this key thought, we will bring part 3 to an end. I will see you again in part 4.